And Professor is an Israeli-American professor at Institute of Service Science, National Tsing Hua University. And her research is focused on statistical and data mining methodology with application in information systems and healthcare. So today she is going to share several dilemmas, challenges, and trade-offs related to acquiring and analysis behavioral big data for healthcare research. So let's welcome her.
So thank you very much for sticking around. Do I need this? Okay, so thank you very much for sticking around for the delay. I guess computers of data scientists is a difficult thing because they're always full of data and analysis, so it's hard to kind of move them ahead. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about behavioral big data. You've probably heard of big data everywhere. And I'm going to talk about research. So this is what will make my talk a little bit different compared to the other talks, the fact that I'm talking about research, as opposed to a lot of the applications that we've seen in the great talks this morning. So a little bit about my academic background, because I think this will give you a better idea of why on earth I'm talking about all of these things. I studied my undergrad in psychology and statistics. And then I decided that I was kind of a little more excited about statistics, so I decided to continue with statistics for my master's and PhD, and then I moved into an engineering institute. So then I moved right into an engineering place, and I teach engineers for a while. And finally, after graduating, I moved to Carnegie Mellon University in the United States. First, I started out in Israel, if you didn't figure that out yet. And at Carnegie Mellon, I was part of the Department of Statistics, which is housed in the social sciences, which is usually, it's an unusual place for a statistics department. But it meant that there were no more engineers in the near vicinity. I had to walk outside to see engineers, and that was a little bit different. And I started working with colleagues in marketing and in epidemiology, and that was a whole different place. And after that, I moved to Maryland, and since then, I've been living in business schools. And moving from an engineering school to a business school is almost as dramatic as moving to Taiwan from somewhere else. It's a different language. Your colleagues talk to you about statistics in words that you've never heard before. Your students are different. Everything is completely different. So I've been moving between worlds that are dramatically different with people with worldviews about what data means and what analysis is that are shocking to someone coming from statistics. Nobody uses statistics the way we are taught statistics is in the department. So this is where where I'm coming from. I then decided the West was enough, so we kind of shifted back to Asia. And I taught for 3 years at the Indian School of Business. And finally, since 2014, I'm here at Tsing Hua, but I'm not in the computer science department and not in the Institute of Statistics. I'm in a strange place called the Institute of Service Science, which is a very interdisciplinary place. So with that, what kind of research do I do? Very hard to tell you what it is. So I say it's entrepreneurial statistical and data mining modeling. It's kind of finding problems that break the current tools and then see if you can develop other tools or modify existing tools to suit them. So it's very problem-oriented, but there's a lot of also methodological stuff that goes on behind the scenes. I do a lot of interdisciplinary work. I work a lot with colleagues outside of my discipline. And I've been doing what's called statistical strategy, which is thinking about how other people are using our tools. And that's very interesting, because if you look at how people in the social sciences use statistics, they use it in a dramatically different way than people in engineering and people in medicine. They're all using it in very different ways, and that led me to probably my most famous work, which is called To Explain or Predict, showing that there are totally different things that different disciplines are trying to optimize. And with statistical models and data mining, you really have completely different ways of doing things when you're doing prediction or explanation. I do a bunch of other things. If you're really curious, you can, of course, Google me if you haven't already. Okay, so let me talk about behavioral big data. Behavioral big data is a kind of big data, but it's a special kind of big data. It means that we're looking at people's measurable behaviors, but we're talking about everyday behavior, the things that they do on their own. Also interactions between people, self-reported opinions, thoughts, feelings, everything that we can measure. And it has a very strong human and social aspect, because now we're talking about people's intentions, their emotions, if they want to be deceptive about things, they want to reciprocate, everything that we do as humans. And this is kind of different from big data, because when we are aware that data is being collected about us, then we change the data, right? So I might do something differently because I know you're measuring me or recording me right now, which means that I can do it either for avoiding some risks, like legal risk, or maybe it's embarrassing, and so on. So big data is different, behavioral big data is different from inanimate big data, and I'm going to talk about healthcare in particular. So if you have inanimate data and you're a researcher, then you're trying to answer some research question, and you have your big data. Okay, it can be on anything. But this is going to be different once you bring the human, and the human can be the patients, the caretakers, the families of them, whoever's in this whole story, the doctors, because now you have one more piece in this story, which is the human subjects. And this is a part that usually doesn't belong in computer science departments, in some statistics departments, and engineering schools. These things are just rows in a data set. They're not human subjects. So a lot of interesting things start happening when we think about the human subjects. So first of all, we think about human subjects, they're very aware, and they have an interaction with the data as we're recording or doing or collecting whatever it is. And the other thing is that they can really be harmed by the data collection or analysis or deployment or whatever it is. So keeping these two things in mind, let's think again about what's going on here. There's physiological big data, and you might say, oh, that's what you're doing, that's what you mean. Well, let's think about it. There's tons of physiological big data right now. You can measure almost every possible thing about the outside to the insides of our bodies. And there's a ton of interesting data science going on using the data from here. But that is measuring something about bodies. And that is talking about some physical measurements. And that's talking about measurements that happen usually at times that the doctor prescribes or the lab prescribes. And it means that if you're undergoing a clinical trial, then you're aware that you're in that clinical trial. You've chosen to do it because you have some interest in doing it. Maybe you have that disease or you're trying to help someone with that disease. And that is kind of different from what happens with behavioral big data. So in behavioral big data, we're not talking about individual bodies. We're talking about people who are connected to each other, and we're measuring different behaviors, as we said before, actions, interactions. And the users here are often the ones who decide when to create the data. So you decide when to post on Facebook. The doctor doesn't send you a note on this date, you should post on Facebook. So everything is very user-generated. And when these big companies are running experiments on us every second, a few experiments, most of us are not even aware that that's going on. And usually it's not in our own personal intention. So the whole scenario is kind of different, and that's why if you go to medical schools versus social sciences, you'll see that their research methods are completely different. If you open a textbooks on research methods in these two areas, you'll be shocked. You won't even believe that they're called research methods on both sides. They're using different instruments to do measurement. They use completely different models in these different areas. And what's special about both of them is, yeah, they both deal with human subjects and with risks. And the first speaker this morning talked about IRB, and I'll say a word about that later on, but the issue of protecting human subjects. But everything is really, really different, which is makes sense, except that today, these two fields are merging. So what is a body and what is a behavior and what is a feeling, these are all coming very closely together. Very famous historian and author, happens to be Israeli, wrote Homo Deus. Anybody read any of these books? He says, the main products of the 21st century economy will not be textiles, vehicles, and weapons, but bodies, brains, and minds. Notice the word minds, that's not a physical object, I guess. And in a pretty large Israeli newspaper, he writes about how physiological data can easily be translated into behavioral data. So this is the name in Hebrew of that very famous newspaper. And I'll translate it approximately like this. If you wear biometric sensors like Fitbit band, and these sensors are connected to the computer will know exactly your heart rate, blood pressure, and adrenaline levels. And based on this, it can identify your emotional state better than any human psychologist. So we're now taking physiological data, and they can actually be indicative of behaviors. There are now even people who are not sick with a certain disease or something, but still they choose to wear things like diabetes monitors. People like to hack their body. So these people will try and figure out from their bodies how they're feeling and things like that. So now let's get into the world of healthcare research. And I'll give you a tour. So this is like a tourist group that we're going through. And I'll give you a tour of the land. So there's going to be all kinds of data, and I'll show you what kinds of new data are out there. And then I'll talk a little bit about the researchers and what kind of things they try to do. And then we'll see what's the value of actually applying some of these things. So if I think about what kind of data there are, let's look back and see what used to be the type of data that people would use. So even this morning we heard a speaker talk about data that comes from a hospital or from some kind of a large medical system. So in a hospital, typically the types of data that people have are information about patients, anything about your personal and medical history, billing information when you're paying, right, that information. You also have a lot of information about the physicians, the doctors, when they actually run their appointments, how long, the procedures, the prescriptions they write, a lot of information about the doctors. You have information about the nurses, where they are maybe even, their work hours. The pharmacy staff, if you have a pharmacy inside the hospital, things about their service, speed and quality of service. You have things about the labs, how fast they work, what they're doing going on there. And there are a lot more about all the other staff. There's financing, right? Big departments down in hospitals, the cleaning people, the receptionists, the volunteers, and in Taiwan, the food courts. So the food court has a lot of data too. How do we collect data about all of these? Well, medical devices collect a lot of this kind of information, especially about patients. We have these health information IT systems that collect a ton of other data that's going on here. Actually, there are now places that use the Wi-Fi, the free Wi-Fi that you get in the hospital, to try and figure out where people are moving to monitor foot traffic. That's pretty useful. And when you think about smart hospitals in some places, then of course they'll have cameras, they'll have sensors, they'll have GPSs, they'll use IoTs in there. So this is where, from a classical hospital, you'll get data on who you'll get data. So the new kind of data, number one, and I'll show you a bunch of new kinds of data, is that we have now information on recorded interactions between these different people. You can have information about relationships between patients and doctors when they're meeting each other, doctors and other doctors when they're consulting about a patient, for example, the family and talking to the hospital staff. There are all kinds of networks going on here with information. One example of this is Google engineers who used information from 90,000 conversations between doctors and patients. So the patient goes to the doctor, they're talking to the doctor, and during that conversation time, they're picking up all the voice and analyzing it, and they're able to actually very, very quickly figure out and transcribe the whole thing. So that's one interesting type of data that researchers have not used before for any of these big data analyses. Another kind is coming out of smart hospitals. So anything from telemedicine, remote patient monitoring, mobile health and e-health. So that's creating more data outside of what we were talking about before, just because there are other kinds of measuring devices here. And this is kind of interesting. It's a recent article here on the FDA that assembles a team to oversee AI revolution in health, because now the problem is that mobile health apps and wearable devices that use AI to help diagnose or even treat medical conditions, they're actually not in the regulatory system. When you build an app like this, nobody tells you first go to the FDA, right? People just start using it. So now these implants and wearables that communicate wirelessly, and we'll talk about mobile a little bit more, is creating a little bit of a new kind of issue. Okay, so now my point is going to be, we're now a lot more powerful. We have a lot more granular behavioral big data. We can do a ton with it. But it also means that it's a lot more dangerous. And I think everybody has now, in the last year at least, started becoming a little uncomfortable about who's using their data and for what. So one question is, when we're looking at all these data, just keep it in the back of your mind, is who's collecting the data? If it's the hospital collecting the data, That's one reason, that's fine. Maybe you want them to get your data, fair enough. But you'll see that in a minute, it's not just the hospital collecting the data anymore. And then you want to ask yourself, are the users aware of this data that's being collected about them? Do you like when people collect data about you that's very private and personal, and you're not even aware of it? So that's another good question. And what are actually the benefits? What's in it for us when this data is collected about us? So things to keep in our mind. Third kind, now we're moving into that area. So that was like a disclaimer, hold your breath. So now we're going to talk about online behavior. And online behavior includes a whole lot of things. First of all, you have lots of websites. I'm sure everybody has used one of these websites to look up some information, or an equivalent one in Chinese, or whatever other your favorite website is. There's lots of online forums, so especially when people are sick, or their family is sick, or their friends are sick and they're trying to find information, they'll find communities and online forums. There's a lot of information on social networks where people share and search for information. And there's also a lot going on in search engines when you're looking up different solutions for yourself to self-treat yourself. So lots of information online about people's behaviors related to healthcare. Notice that when we're here, as opposed to the hospital, all this information is voluntarily entered by whoever this user is. So you could be entering your personal details to open accounts, you could be uploading photos, maybe of the rash that you had last week. You're posting all kinds of comments, messages, your search terms when you're searching, payment information if you're buying any kind of stuff, and even sometimes your connections. So this user answered that one and they've now become connected. So a lot of information is showing up here. Besides the stuff that you're actively and voluntarily posting, there's a lot of the metadata about right, where you went from to and what kind of, how long you spent on different pages. So all that is data as well, and all that is being collected. Okay, another one is the self-logged information that people use apps for. So dieting apps is a very, very classic one. Right? Many people use this and they log themselves, the food that they're eating and the exercise that they're doing, and even things like how far did you park your car today. Menstruation apps are super popular as well. They turn out to really offer a service that a lot of women want, but notice how much information they ask for that has really nothing to do with your menstruation necessarily. So here again, there's a lot of information that the users voluntarily upload or comment, but it's a lot beyond just physical information. There's a lot more there. There's also, again, all the passive footprints. When did you log in? How often do you log in? Who are you friends with? Which pages did you browse? Location, of course. And what's interesting is that these kinds of apps, the amount of data that they have is incredible. Every day, for example, women manually log 1.4 million new data points. That's just in that one app, including cycle history, ovulation, pregnancy tests, age, height, weight, lifestyle statistics about sleep, activity, and nutrition. Okay, so there's a lot of information going on there. This is without even mixing it with the other data that's collected by other apps. This is one of the biggest period trackers called Flow. It's funny, they publicize themselves by, we're the best ones since we included a neural network. Okay, fine. Apparently there's also a very popular one in Chinese called Meet You by Tencent. Notice something kind of interesting, this review of the app. Someone did it in Taiwan. That was kind of interesting. Anyway, so there are lots of these, and they collect a ton of data. They're the most popular ones. But then, and they collect not only that information, but they actually go beyond that. They're asking things about clothes and fitness. They have groups where people actually create a little group and start talking about community stuff. So there's a lot of information here that's way beyond just physical stuff. Then there was an interesting article that asked, hey, hold on a minute, we're getting all this data, what are they doing with our data? And it turns out that, of course, the biggest ones, or most of these apps, what do they do with our data? They sell it. So, when I heard this, I definitely changed some of the apps I was using, because not all of them sell your data, but the big ones who usually have like the best algorithms, they're the ones who sell your data. For example, an alternative, which is kind of interesting, and my point is that there are big differences in the cultures of who's creating the apps, is this is a menstruation app called Clue, And what they pride themselves in is that they only make their data available in de-identified form to selected research projects, and they work with universities such as Columbia University and Oxford, and they have certain agreements with certain groups there, so it's, they're not selling your data, and they tell you what they use it for. It's for improving women's health. So they even have call for proposals. If you think of a cool project you want to do with them, you can actually submit a project and go there. So again, remember the question in the back of your head? Who's collecting the data? What are they doing with it? Are you, as a subject, aware that it's being collected and being used in that way? Good questions. Another kind of new data that's being used is gaming. And this was a pretty popular game called Seahorse Quest. And it was designed in order to help and diagnose dementia. So it was a game that's played not only by people who are sick, but lots of people who are playing it so that they can collect data and try and determine if people are suffering from dementia using that data. So they use the data to train the algorithm. So another kind of place that collects data about us is gaming. And who has the data? And what are they doing with it? And are you happy giving the data to them or not? All good questions to keep in mind. IoT, Internet of Things, all these little gadgets that are connected to the internet and collecting a lot of information about us. Of course, the phone is already part of our body, but all these things we think are on top of our body, right? Like the Fitbit. So it turns out that in the United States, for example, a lot of these Fitbit things are required by workplaces in order to give you insurance, health insurance. If you don't wear it, that's okay. You don't have to wear it, but we won't give you insurance. This is an example again where they have to use it so that they can track them, which means that now the insurance companies have all that behavioral big data. That's kind of interesting. Insurance companies are usually not your best friend. So I don't know if you want to share all your personal data with them. And we talked about even things like that. Then let's step even farther away. So up to here, you could say, okay, people realize they're wearing a Fitbit. Maybe they realize it's just, their bloods, their heart rate that they're measuring. That's kind of physical, physiological, health related. But if we go one step further, there's a lot of other data that are indicative about your health, be it mental health, be it physical health. So if we step even one step further, it turns out that doctors for a long time wanted this information. So doctors want information about consumer and financial, they want statistics on poverty, housing density, and unemployment. They want all that information, except that doctors are too busy. So doctors are not data scientists, they don't have time to collect the data, they don't have time to clean the data, patients don't have time to start answering surveys about all this information. But again, this is data that deemed useful for answering a lot of medical questions. So it turns out that this kind of data is really actually collected. So remember again, my little disclaimer, let's see who collects it. So when we're wearing one of these little gadgets, it's not only measuring the steps, yeah, we know that, but it's actually, if you're wearing one of these smartwatches, it's also measuring things like your phone calls, right, when you get those, and your meeting and events, your keystrokes, when you're kind of on the keyboard. So there's a lot more going on here, behavioral, emails, outgoing emails, incoming emails. If I look at a graph of my inbox, I think I'm already not feeling so well. So there's a very tight kind of linkage between these non-related information and activities and your health. This is a very interesting app that's going to tell you that you're depressed even before you know it yourself. And what these guys at MindStrong did is they're looking at how you swipe and tap and type on your keyboard, and based on those patterns, they're able to tell if you're losing your memory. So memory problems can be spotted by looking at things including how rapidly you type and what errors you make, such as how frequently you delete characters. We do that all the time, right? As well as by how fast you scroll down a list of contacts. So you're kind of going back and slowing back. So again, here, of course, they did testing, and the people who did the testing understood what they were going in for. But actually, they have an app. Unfortunately, I think most of us can't download it because it's right now restricted to only people in the United States who are part of some kind of an insurance healthcare company who's using this benefit program. So they tried to limit who can download the app and use this right now, because they realized very quickly that there's issues with collecting these kinds of data. So this is an app that was started by doctors, not a Silicon Valley kind of thing. And they realized that while monitoring says it protects user data, collecting such data at all could be a scary prospect for many people it aims to help. And they talk specifically about these employee wellness plans that the insurance companies are using them for. So that's why I think this is limited. If you go to the App Store, you'll see that. And they actually, the company itself has, if you go to their website, they have an ethical, legal, social implications board, because they realize that they're dealing here with something that's a lot more than just an app that's collecting your swipes. Okay, so this awareness is beginning to come, but I mentioned before that, notice this, these were doctors who started this. Doctors in the medical sciences and the social sciences are a lot more aware of these issues of human subjects. But how many people here are not from a medical or social sciences background? How many people here are like from engineering, computer science, business? Yeah, and for all of us, we've never heard of any ethics stuff when we went to school. For us, it was data. Okay, so now it becomes kind of interesting. Nice little companies like Microsoft, right? If anybody owns an Xbox, you might want to lock it up after you see my slides here. But what it turns out that the Kinect, that helps you play really well and nicely, it can measure lots of things, like it doesn't even touch you, right? You're kind of away from that machine. And just by your skin color that it gets through the cameras, it can monitor your heart rate. It reads the beats per minute wirelessly on a person standing 4 feet away. And can also detect slight eye and muscle movement. So it's a very, very sensitive data collection system. And in fact, since it belongs to Microsoft, you might want to ask yourself, what do they mean when they talk about 360 data collection? Why do they call themselves 360? No, they don't. Okay, so Microsoft also has a lot of information about you, like signing in and signing off, games that you're playing, your game score statistics, all the hardware and operating performance, network performance data, and they also tell you to make sure you're not cheating. We're also collecting your IP address and all this information. And to improve your gaming experience, we're also going to collect all your Bing search terms and samples of voice commands. So now, all that together with your skin color is you. And we can use that and have a lot of very nice and rich data. Beautiful. Who else has data about us? Not just the big companies. Amazon has this nice little wristband that people in these kinds of environments have to wear to make sure that they don't slack off. So that's kind of monitoring from far. And the workplace is becoming a really a test bed for a lot of things. So there's also a company who makes ID badges. In Taiwan, we wear a lot of these badges, so this is probably going to be a big market. And this badge actually listens to everything. And what is this badge going to help you with? Do you hog office conversations? Are you the one talking the most? Or not talking enough? Does your voice squeal? Do you sit very still at your desk, or do you fidget under stress? So this little badge is kind of following you around and trying to help monitor and regulate your behavior. So a lot of things from just a little ID card at work. And those people who are working at the service industry of answering calls, right, the call centers, so now they have software that helps you watch your tone. So if you're beginning to sound a little more aggressive because the customer is driving you crazy, it will tell you you're a little too aggressive now. Or if you sound really, really tired, it's like you should lift your energies up because you sound a little bit too tired. So it's listening to you and tagging your behavior and telling you, helping you improve your performance. Uber claims to create this very beautiful addition to healthcare because it found that an alarming statistics about patient care and health client at sea, people are not coming to the hospitals, or they're not going to their appointments, so Uber wants to help. And what Uber did is creates this little app that allows the doctors or the hospital itself to book the cabs for the patient. So the patient doesn't need to know how to use an app or Uber or something like that. They can do it for them. That's very nice. And they can see where the patients are going from the hospital Where are they going next? Where are they coming from? Very useful app to learn a little more about trips and hospitals. Okay, putting the healthcare stuff with the other stuff. So everybody's jumping on this, and don't worry, this is HIPAA compliant, so it's okay and safe to use it. All right, so we talked about the kind of data, and I hope you get a feeling about how everything is out there now. Whether we know it, whether we like it, it doesn't matter. Everything about us, and it's just beyond just measuring our physical measurements, because our physical measurements say a lot about our inner, or whatever we call those human things. So now let's see what happens in the world of research. So typically, who used to do research in using health data? We're talking about hospitals kind of data. Operations research and industrial engineering were huge departments in universities who would use these kinds of data to improve staffing, scheduling, anything around that. They've been using it for a long time. Then you have, of course, people in the medical and healthcare field, and they're trying to use this to improve outcomes, right? Medical outcomes, and improve safety. And there's also a whole group of people in information systems, and they try to use these kinds of data for improving the design and use of different kinds of information systems. But now there's like a whole new gang of people who are working in this field. And that includes people in marketing, people in advertising, people in insurance, machine learning, right? So we have the whole machine learning groups coming into this field. And some of the social science people have walked into this door as well. And what this means is that, yeah, the whole data, kind of data are new, and some of these people can't even deal with the new data because they don't have the technical skills. But the whole new people here working in this research field are not aware of a lot of the human subject issues that have been going on for a long time. So it creates a lot of interesting gaps. It also creates amazing opportunities for collaboration. So how do we get such kind of data? I mean, we're not Google and we're not Microsoft. We're just university professors. So one thing is, yeah, we go and look for open data or available data. And surprisingly, there's some reasonable data sets here and there. It's not huge, but it's there. And you'll get a data dump, someone who put a big file out there or something like that. Or we'll go and do web scraping if it's information on forums or stuff like that. Some of it's no longer legal. Some of it used to be legal. That keeps changing. The technology's changing. And there's a whole nice source of hack data out there. People who will scrape a whole website and just dump it and say, oh, and I made it free for research, so it should be online forever. So there's a lot of hack data and a lot of ethical questions whether we can use that or not. Another more common way is that we will partner with a company or with an organization like Microsoft, right? Or a hospital or whatever it is. And then either both parties are interested in the research question, that's the ideal case, but many times that doesn't really happen, so then you have to buy the data from them. Other options, of course, is your personal connections. So when we go on sabbaticals or our students go out on internships or things like that, you create relationships, and those often start collaborations that end up with data. There are also partnerships that some universities or schools will have with a whole organization. That also happens a lot. A third strange way is through things like Amazon Mechanical Turk or crowdsourcing. Here's an example of a paper where people use Mechanical Turk to recruit participants for an intervention related to alcohol consumption. So you pay people a little bit money. I don't think they gave them alcohol, they just asked them questions. That's another way to get data. And finally, this has become a very alarming new source of data. When I go to conferences now, people shamelessly say, and we have 1.5 million data points on people who donated blood in China. And there are lots of papers happening with that. And good question on what the ethics are if you come from a country where this is not allowed and you use data that way. But that's a big source of data that's going on now in academia. Okay, so now what is happening here? I told you a little bit more about the ethics part, but there's a lot of issues that happen because of these new data types and sources that came in. So first of all, opportunities. Between the researcher, we now have research questions that we couldn't answer before. So what's called old question, but we have new data that we can actually answer questions that were not possible to answer before. So that's very, very awesome. Or maybe now we can answer it in a more accurate way. The other thing that's pretty cool is that now we can ask new questions that didn't even exist before because maybe there was no technology like that before, and we're asking a question about how this technology impacts people. So these are the two kinds of questions that we will ask, and they both have problems now because if it's a new question, there'll be no literature for us to review and compare against. And science is a very incremental thing. You start with something and you keep improving it a little bit and comparing yourself to what used to be there before. But if there was nothing there before, you're starting from fresh and the ground is a little bit more shaky. If you're answering an old question with the new data, then now your new data have all these new measurements and you have to convince me that this measurement is really measuring the same thing as what the old things were trying to do. So if you used to ask people about their emotion in a survey, and that was the classical way and that was validated over years, and now all of a sudden your emotion is the skin color, then you have to convince me that skin color is indeed measuring what I'm trying to tell you it is. Now this raises a lot of issues. First of all, remember how we get the data. So if I'm collaborating with a company, then there's often a conflict in terms of the scientific goals versus the company's goals, let's say a clinical goal or a commercial goal. And that's going to be a big problem. That's why I said I'll show you two examples soon, but that creates some serious problems. Another big challenge that arises is that many times there's going to be a predictive goal, or personalized predictions even, versus a causal explanation of what on earth is causing this result. And those are very, very different things that can be conflicting. And when people tell you, I want to do both, well, tough luck, that's not going to work. You're going to have to do two different studies. Again, there's average treatment effects where people are interested in, social scientists are very interested in average effects. Economists are really interested in average effects. What's going to happen if we put in this new policy? Whereas in a lot of the machine learning kind of applications, we're interested in personalized stuff. So that again creates a little bit of a tension between these goals. When we look at this researcher to human subjects relationship, what happened now with all the online and IoT kind of data is that now the distance between these two people are much farther. So if before you were a psychology professor and people would come into your lab and do the experiments, now you never see your subjects, ever, right? There's someone playing a game online that you maybe know their IP address. That's how familiar you are to them and they are to you. So this very larger distance that you have is creating a lot of issues. Again, first of all, because you have all these new ways of connection through social networks and forums and IoTs and apps, everything here is becoming a lot more dangerous in terms of not only security, but how you're using the data. And these new risks, besides the old HIPAA compliance, what do you do now when you have a doctor who's talking to a patient through Facebook? That's kind of an interesting question. It's not even a safe place to talk. So a lot of issues are going to come up here in this space right there. This is my most technical slide, so bear with me. When we talk about this relationship between the research question and the behavioral big data, then these are some of the issues that are causing a lot of the big sagas that we're seeing and reading about in the newspapers. First of all, when we do science, we have some data set, but the end of the analysis, the goal is to generalize it out, right? Nobody really cares so much about the sample that you're using. And generalization is going to be a function of a lot of different things. One of them is the unit of analysis versus the unit of measurement. If I have users who are using my app, I don't know if that user is one person, the whole family, how many people are actually accessing that account, okay? But if all my analysis is done as if it's a person, then I have a big gap that's giving me answers that are wrong in some way. So I'm not generalizing to the same level or unit of analysis. There are big issues of under and over coverage. So when you get a data set like this of people who are using this service, then how are these people different from everybody else that you're trying to say something about or apply your science to? And again, the users of internet in the world even is a small percentage. The users of certain apps versus others, everything is very, very skewed and not generalizable to a lot of other populations. So I have to think very carefully about these issues. Again, there's a lot of differences between personalized effects, how a certain intervention is going to affect you, versus how on average it's going to increase the company's revenue. And that's going to be a very big difference. If I want to measure this, if I want to measure that, and if I'm doing this, I can't say anything about how well I'm doing that. If I'm measuring this, I can't say how well I'm doing on doing that. And finally, on the this angle here between the researcher and the behavioral big data, then remember that the people who used to do this kind of thing, social scientists, medical schools, they don't have the technical expertise to deal with huge amounts of data. Again, the speaker in the morning was talking about their huge database problems and how we even get it in and analyze it. They don't even know how to analyze. I mean, some of the statistical tools just break down when you have millions and billions of records. It just won't work, right? You have to start parallelizing things. Not everything is parallelizable. Sometimes you have to take samples, and people in machine learning don't like taking samples because they have the whole data set. Okay, so there are a lot of issues that start happening here, and that's why I said collaborations are so needed here, because different communities have very different expertise in different parts. The final piece down here, which is again one of the causes of big breakdowns of a lot of cool things, which I'll show in a minute, is that the data that you get in this new era of data are really contaminated. What are they contaminated by? For example, company algorithms. The companies keep running experiments all the time. There's a new policy, there's a new sale, there's a new this, there's never a control, a benchmark, because everything is constantly being engaged with. The users themselves are contaminating the data by self-selecting to use or not to use to log in. There are also spillover effects because everyone is so networked that if you're giving me treatment, I'll tell my friends about the coupons, so they'll also get the coupons. So everything starts spilling over between people, whereas before I used to just say, you guys get it randomly, and you guys don't get it randomly, and that's it. Now everything kind of spills over in a worse way than it used to do before. So this is kind of the big map of the research big challenges that we're getting in here. And I'm going to try and illustrate this through two examples. Two of these papers made a big splash. This one was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's the big Facebook experiment called Emotional Contagion in Social Networks. And the second one is the Google flu, detecting influenza epidemics using search engine query data. This was published in Nature. And let me show you how some of these problems I just mentioned manifest. So the Facebook example, notice that the authors here are from Facebook and from Cornell University. And if you want to know the whole story, one of them studied at Cornell and then went to work at Facebook. Okay, all right. And what they did was, here, I'll tell you what they did. We show via a massive experiment with almost 1 million people on Facebook that emotional states can be transferred to others via emotional contagion. What did they do? They took news feeds of people and they wanted to see whether if you see less happy news on your news feed, you're going to be more depressed and post less happy stuff. And then the other way around, we'll remove some negative stuff from the feed that you're seeing and see whether you're less negative. So that's what they did. They randomly took these people. If you have a US account, you might have been one of them. And then for a period of, I can't remember, 2 weeks or something, you just saw less happy stuff or less negative stuff, or you were in the control group. Okay, that's what they did. And they found out that indeed it's contagious. So we provide experimental evidence that emotional contagion occurs without direct interaction. So they're asking a very old question about contagion, but they have an amazing new tool to answer this question. Okay, so what happened here? It turns out that, again, if you're at a university like Cornell, which is a pretty well-known university, you have to go through something called an IRB, or internal review board, called an ethics board, where if you're going to do any experimentation on human subjects, you have to go through that board in the university that will approve or disapprove or help you improve your design to make sure that you're not risking or harming the subjects. But they actually did go to their IRB committee and said, hey, we don't need your approval because Facebook already did the experiment. We just got the data. Facebook did it. So they said, you're right, according to the rules, fine, you're off. So the work was consistent with Facebook's data use policy, to which all users agree, you all agreed, on your account. So no problem, there was consent. Part of what IRB requires is that when you do an experiment on subjects, they give you their consent, and they understand you, right? And they understand what you're asking for them, and you click, I accept, and then you start the survey, or whatever it is. Okay? So this was kind of a blanket coverage, and what happened here, nothing here was illegal, this was all fine, but the editor of the journal actually ended up publishing an expression of concern saying, yeah, it was fine, but this is a concern, we really need to think about consent, and so on. This is from 10 years ago, right? If you look at what happened outside of this journal, some communities, the data science community said, the data mining said, what are you talking about? Finally we get results, this is so interesting, this is so cool, we finally validated some questions that we had. But others were really, really angry, how can you use our data without asking what's with consent? So big issue going on here. And I think the main question is, where did the data scientists get our ethics training? And to be very honest with you, I graduated with a PhD in statistics and did not ever hear of an ethics board or anything in the university. The first time I heard of it was when I was at Carnegie Mellon in the social sciences department, right? And that's when I was teaching with a fellow statistician who was an excellent social science statistician, and he taught about IRB, and I sat in his class and listened, and I was totally shocked. But I'm sure that many of you have no idea what this is. Okay, so if we don't learn about it, how will we know about it? No way for us to know. So this little this little Facebook saga, really they were trying to answer an old question with new data. That's what they were trying to do. And there was a big problem here between the scientific and the commercial goal. Why does Facebook care about this? What is Facebook going to do with this result that you can manipulate someone's emotions? Okay, well, I understand why the scientists wanted to know, because that's a useful thing to know about human nature, right? Okay, then we have all these ethical challenges that we talked about a minute ago. You get the feel of where this was going. I'm going to go quickly to the other example, which was the Google flu trends. And what they did, and notice again, detecting influenza using search engine query data. So you're searching for stuff on google.com, and they're using the keywords and trying to figure out whether there's a flu outbreak. Notice here again, the authors are from Google and from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a government organization. So this is an interesting collaboration. And what they did was the following. They're trying to say, look, if you're using the data from CDC that they're collecting about people who are confirmed to have the flu, mortality or morbidity, it comes in too late. It's very, very late by the time you get that data. You can't detect new things that are happening. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at queries, because people type things before they end up in the hospital, sick. That was the idea there. So they used automated search results for 50 million keywords during this period. This is how they trained their algorithm. And for every query, they had the text and the IP address. And they used this combination. They fit, it's not 450, it's 450 million different models to the data. We're talking about training here. And they correlated every query with every possible thing. And at the end, they came up with 45 queries with the highest correlation to flu outbreaks. Sounds interesting? Here's what happened. Before I tell you what happened, I can tell you that their idea was not the first time it happened. Actually, when I was at Carnegie Mellon, this is pre-9/11, we were collecting exactly these kinds of data to see whether it's possible to detect a flu-like outbreak due to terrorism. But we looked back then at data from WebMD, and it was very hard to get data from them. We got just a little piece. And that's one of the biggest things that are difficult for someone who's not at Google, is getting good data. So big challenge here is getting the data. And in fact, there are other researchers. This is a group in Australia of epidemiologists, Craig Dalton and his group, who try to collect this kind of information by having a network of people who fill in information all the time. So there are lots of different ways that researchers are trying to get this kind of data that Google has, or kind of different. But that's the big problem here. And what happened with these guys is that it started out pretty good, pretty well. They would alarm before the CDC data would come in. So they got this nice lead time on CDC. But then it turned out that something really bad happened. And it turned out that the algorithm wasn't clear if it was learning flu or if it was learning winter, because usually the flu happens in winter. So what happened was that the algorithm was constantly overestimating what was going on. And at some point it got even worse than the older CDC data. It was so bad that you were better off using the slow CDC data that were coming in. Now there was a lot of issues reported. One is they say, hey, how come Google never told us what are these 45 search terms? You found 45? Tell us what they are so we can validate it so that we can see what's going on there. They didn't want to release it. And then there were all kinds of recommendations. Oh, so why don't you combine your data with the CDC data? All kinds of ways to try and solve the data science problem. But it turned out that it's really not an issue of being more clever in terms of algorithms. The problem turned out to be that it's the way Google changed their search engine. So do you remember when we did not used to have this part when you search? This is relatively new. Yeah? And why is this here? Because Google wants to keep you longer inside Google so you see more advertisements and blah, blah, blah. But when they did this, it means that when you're searching, the way you count now your searches is different than before this. So this algorithm really messed up their flu tracking algorithm, and that's an example, again, of where it kind of killed your data. This kind of research is still going on. There are lots of groups working on this, some people trying to use clinicians' search query, not the users, but the doctors. Some people are trying to use Wikipedia usage to try and predict flu. Some people are trying to use Twitter. It's not over. Even though this bad thing happened, people still don't realize that we have this main issue going on. So again, this little example is really illustrating a lot of the issues that happen with company algorithms, issues of unit of analysis versus unit of measurement. And I'm kind of just throwing ideas here at you to show you that it's the same problems that are coming up with a lot of these applications. Lastly, I'll just mention there's lots of new ways to measure things that we couldn't measure before. This is a very interesting book by a guy who came up with an idea to measure things, behaviors that you'll never tell anybody about. So when you fill a survey, you don't really have an incentive to tell the truth. But when you're searching on Google, you definitely have the incentive. Why are you searching? You want the answer. So this guy basically looks for all the most controversial kind of things, and he shows things like that. Totally unexpected, no survey ever uncovered these questions, nobody ever knew these were the answers. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna get, my last point is about data privacy, and we all know that now finally it's on the table. I've been really afraid and kind of, as I said, I had an identity conflict with being a statistician and data miner for 15 years and equipping MBAs with really strong and powerful tools. And finally, all hell broke out loose last year, and I'm finally glad because it's been going on for a long time and we just need a little more awareness and regulation of what's going on in here. So, even people who build tools realize it's not enough to build tools. So when our friend here was talking to Congress, he realized that it's not enough just to build tools. I don't know if he really meant it, but that's what he said. Okay, so we're going to go beyond tools and start thinking about what is going on here. The medical area is worried because a lot of the interactions now are happening in insecure places, non-private places. Doctors are talking to patients on social networks, and really they don't know how to deal with it. They're writing all these do's and don'ts and things like that. This is the AMA Medical Association, American Medical Association Journal of Ethics. Why can't we be friends? A case-based analysis of ethical issues with social media and healthcare. So this is something that is already in the awareness of the medical literature, again, because those people have been very, very sensitized to human subjects from day one in that field. But while medical stuff is very regulated, what happens to big data? Turns out that that's not yet regulated. Well, now it's beginning, right, since last year. Israeli parliament mulls the laws regulating big data health app usage. So it turns out that there was this nice big hospital who tried out a nice AI system to determine who gets surgery. But they never asked the people who they use their data to train this algorithm for consent. And this came out to the newspapers, the media brought it out, and eventually actually the government changed the law in Israel. As I said, everything changed last May. And I think everybody here heard the word GDPR and everyone's confused about how on earth is this going to change everything. It is already changing a lot. It's really regulating how you can collect the data, how you can use the data, how you can store the data, how you can reuse the data. And it's affecting not just the European Union, it's affecting everyone, every company, big and small, that wants to work with either users or vendors or whatever in the EU. Of course, there's a lot of legislation also going on now in other countries. I know Taiwan is also contemplating some things going on there. And this really gives a whole different story to a whole different twist to the story, because now it gives rights to the subjects. Anything from right to be forgotten. So if you've had an account with a certain, I don't know, app or whatever, and they're telling you they're GDPR compliant, you should be able to write them an email or something and say, I want you to erase all my data and delete everything that I have. And they also have to make an effort to try and remove the data from third parties that they shared your data with. A little harder, but at least they have to show that they made an effort. Things about being able to rectify your data. If your data on their app is wrong or on their service is wrong, you should be able to correct it. Rights to, okay, this one's a big one, automated decision making. So not allowed to use decisions solely on automated means, including what they call profiling, which is basically using AI. So a lot of these things now are changing the rules on how companies are allowed to collect, treat, save, use the data of users. So when you're seeing all these GDPR notices that you're agreeing to and saying, I saw, these are your rights. On the other side of the world, in academia, we have what's called IRBs, as I mentioned before, these ethics committees, and they've been there for a very long time. So while the industry was totally unregulated, academia and academics were bound a lot more than anybody else. But to be honest, the IRB ethics committees don't really know what to do with us when we come to talk to them about behavioral big data. They know what to do with the medical sciences, they know what to do with the social scientists, but if someone from data science or I don't know, a computer science, machine learning department has this big data set that they collected on blah, 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 most of these committee members will not have an idea how to treat or decide on their case. So it's a very kind of contaminated area right now. It's gonna get better, but just realize that this is a little bit of a problem. And remember, we don't have training right now. And if you look at training materials, for example, at National Tsing Hua, I think every graduate student has to go through some kind of an online ethics course now. But if you look at the examples, they're all from like medical. A doctor goes to Congo and does this and that. Or something related to social science, but it's not related to behavioral big data. It's not related to the human subjects and the app data and all this elaborate information that we talked about before. None of it includes it yet. I think it's just a matter of time, but that's going to happen a little later. Finally, I just noticed that another interesting problem is that the organization that basically leads the whole IRB is the Human and Health and Human Services in the United States, and they govern the whole IRB. And last year they came with an update, and it used to be called the Common Rule, and now they have something called the Final Rule, which is a very strange name. But the Final Rule actually makes things easier for researchers. So they made new kinds of exemptions that make things easier. And before this whole change happened, they had an open forum where researchers could send in their opinions. And there were very strong opinions from some groups saying, this is really wrong. You have to be very careful about how people are allowed to use private information, personal information. And yet again, IRB made things a little bit easier. So in industry, things are becoming more strict with GDPR. On the academia side, things are getting a little bit more lenient, which means that now maybe there's a little bit more ease of collaboration between industry and academia. So finally, again, GDPR, nobody really knows what's happening there right now. Everybody's just kind of a little bit shell-shocked. Big companies are getting big fines. But as a researcher, the main things to keep in your head if you haven't gone through ethics training is, am I respecting the rights of my data subjects? Rights like consent, right? They agree. Think of yourself, if you were one of those rows in the data, how would you feel? What would you want? Would you want people to ask you if it's okay, not okay? What kind of risks are you imposing on them? Pseudonymization is this new word for basically saying that it's not identifiable, so I can't link the data to you. Okay, as long as we can't link it, that's easier. And we can talk about what are risks and what is minimal risk. We wrote a paper that's going to come out soon in Big Data that tries to help guide data scientists through this crazy new regulation that's written in a very legal way. So if you're interested, you can take a look there. So to summarize, I introduced a whole landscape of new kinds of data that were not typically used by researchers in healthcare or in related areas. These are amazingly new, rich kinds of data. They open up a ton of opportunities for answering old questions, for answering new questions, for solving problems that we didn't even know that we had. But with all these amazing new data sets, there's a whole set of challenges. And again, I'm talking about the ethical part is one piece, and that's blowing up very big. right now, but there's a whole other set of scientific problems and challenges that we're all encountering, and if you're doing research in this field, then definitely worth to think about some of these, because that's going to make the difference between the good research and the research that just blows up in a later journal. So I think I'm going to stop right here, and thank you very much.
Okay, thanks Professor for sharing the great topic. Not only cover the latest approach of the healthcare behavioral big data collection, but also cover about the new challenge and about privacy and ethical problems. And we have several questions now, but because the time is a little late, so maybe we can choose one of the questions on Slido. And there is one question. The first question is talking about what do you think about the company who is using blockchain to protect users' privacy, data privacy.
Okay, so I guess the question is, why are they doing it? And then, what do they do with that data? Because you can protect the privacy really well. I don't know, it's a good question. What is the model behind what you're doing? And I think the question is also, who are you collaborating with? Who is this data going to? So as long as the user maybe knows where it's going and tracking, fine. But I think that most people don't really understand the concept. Most ordinary people outside of this room won't even understand what that means. So it's a good question if you can make it understandable enough to the user that they understand what is protected and what is not protected. So yeah, any technologies that can help. There are also other technologies that companies are using to try, and that's a big opportunity now in this field. The privacy preserving data mining, right? Not just at the collection phase, but at the mining phase. So all these privacy protection kind of technologies, either the collection or the analysis, I think those are going to be huge. Those are also very highly sought now in companies who need to deal with GDPR.
Is there any question follow-up with this about blockchain issue? No. Because we'll have a roundtable session right after this session. So if you have any other questions, want to follow up with Professor Galit, then we can follow up at 5 o'clock. We will have a roundtable session, and you can interact with the professor directly. And now we have a little break, and I will talk about how will the roundtable session be processed. And